This is Amy with Creative Catapult Coaching, who is not ready as typical.
And this is Megan with Focus Like a Mother and Change HP, and that's okay because we can trim the beginning, Amy.
That's all right, but then I'd have to do my intro again. So today
Nope.
we wanted to take the Control Alt Think podcast and talk about the downsides of hyperfocus, which is kind of the flip side of, the brain being everywhere. ADHD and a lot of the executive function stuff coming out of neurodivergent brains we're consistently inconsistent. Hyper-focused people so often love because we get stuff done. The downside being sometimes our brain only wants to hyper-focus on things that aren't effective. The flip side of ADHD or of hyper-focus is kind of where my brain is my brain doesn't want to focus on anything at all.
And the downside, so my perspective is always like general neurodivergence and somewhat of the parent brain fog space. So the downside of being really wrapped up in something or like that hyper focus of like like I was working on something till 2 in the morning last night because it was just it needed to happen. Part of me is like, I really want to work on this. I really want to finish it. Like my brain really wants to finish something, and I don't know if that's tied to the neurodivergence or just the fact that um I get a lot of interruptions all the time from uh tiny tyrants that I've created. Uh, so it's like, oh, I get a chance to like finish something and get all the way completed. But the counter to that is that I guess the one of the downsides is it's like pulling teeth painful trying to shift to do something else. So um like the stuff I've been hyper focused on is all computer work. And so I've actually used the laptop I will unplug from the charger and I can work on X project until the battery goes and then I have to go plug it in. And so actually over the weekend I asked my husband, I said, now I can go sit where this charger is and continue working, or this is like an accountability point of I could put the laptop down and go do something else. But I actually asked an outside person because it was like, because this over here, this is what I really want to go do. But I can really make myself go do this other thing, which is also fun, but it is not what I'm currently hyper focused on.
Right. And it sounds like using the external accountability of in your case, your husband, to help you shift the focus should it be needed. And, there's house stuff to do that, needs to be done now, or you guys need to go somewhere. You're asking for that extra leverage to redirect your focus because it is painful to kind of pull your brain out of that really intense space.
And
I
the
just,
and the laptop. So the laptop
and
will
the
give
laptop.
me a
Right.
warning. You're at 50% battery. Then it'll give like a critical warning of you have 6% left and I'm going to shut myself off soon. And so when I get that
Right.
second one, it's like, all right, I guess I'm hitting my accountability moment of maybe I should take a break. Because also when we're hyper focused, we forget to eat, we forget to sleep, we forget to bodily function.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I just came back from the CHAD conference on ADHD. So, not surprisingly, there was plenty of talk about hyperfocus and all of the stuff. And one of the presenters told a story about, you know, how meds for her helped her basically focus and hyperfocus. But when the meds kicked in, she better darn well be focused on whatever she intended to focus on because she won't be able to switch gears. And if she's sitting in the bathtub scrolling Instagram, she will do that for the next 4 hours.
Mm.
And she had done that, which again was that painful recognition that many in the audience had also had similar experiences that, ADHD meds can totally help you focus, but if you're not always focused on where you intend, it doesn't help with shifting the focus.
That's a good point.
not that yours is med-induced, but again, there are similarities in so many of the ways this shows up that it's, just interesting to note that it's, so if a kid gets hyper fixated on video games or doing a thing and, mom, dad asks them to come inside for dinner, it's like, that painful point like you had of trying to do something non-computer based. Kids too can experience that, and shifting as somebody else's demand is really hard.
Well, and it's interesting because when you said doing something non-computer based, the thing that comes up in my mind from over the weekend was I could do other things. Like I could make as an adult, and mine wasn't medication induced or anything. It was just like, this is cool. I want to work on this. I'm really excited about it.
And that's
And
another point
it's
of
either way, but it's
the
still here. And I could
ADHD
make
or
myself go do other
neurodivergence.
things, but I was not constantly, that's, we can't use the literal word constantly, but I was frequently, my brain was wandering off of, oh, what about this with that same, my brain, even though the laptop was in another room or in another city if I'm out running errands,
Brain's still
my
there.
brain is like, but what about, and I caught myself doing it while I was running errands this morning, is like, oh, I wonder if, so there's places where I can support that by, oh, I'll listen to a podcast that's related to whatever the topic is while I drive to kind of ease the tension. But it's like the brain really wants to go finish whatever that is, or really wants to go learn whatever that is.
Right. So hyperfocus can be a double-edged sword, and so much with ADHD and a lot of the other neurodivergence labels, having interest-based nervous systems or, interest-driven periods of intense focus. We kind of want to keep doing it until our brain is done. And external circumstances don't always designate done in this kind of nervous system.
Yes, and it could be something as I don't even have the word for it, but it could be something like a special interest where it's
Yeah,
not
exactly.
like a time-based project of, well, when I get this paper done, I'm done. It could be something of, well, I've learned this fact, and now I'm going to learn this related fact, and I'm going to go find out about it. Just becomes an all-encompassing thing if it's a special interest or some really deep topic. And there isn't really an external like end point that it's not like a project. Oh, when I get this done and turn it in, I'm done. Um, even though mine started with a project for for coaching school, and now it's just um,
It's
so they
expanding.
they have these interests have a mind of their own. They're just uh, they're wild. Amy, what does hyper focus have to do with it, do or not do with tendril theory?
That's a really interesting question. I think they're related, but I can't necessarily speak to specifically how they're related as far as like neural circuits and all that. But tendril theory, um, someday we'll get sophisticated enough to actually flash the cartoons or the other things up. But it's basically, um, with tendril theory, a lot of neurodivergence are thoughts and, full on physical and psychological experience when we're deeply involved in something, and asking us to switch gears can be like having your hair ripped out. You need time to retract the pieces.
The cartoon
So
I think of is
probably,
uh like Medusa's snake hair coming out. Like it just kind of comes out. And yeah, it's like getting it all ripped off.
yeah. And I think that there's probably parallels, but I'm not, because neither one of these is necessarily super, they're all used in popular culture nomenclature,
Mhm.
but not necessarily like, here's a really specific clinical term, even though some of these sound clinical and are nice to have like a description that other people get for the way our brains or bodies are experiencing things. And so I'm not sure that there's a real official correlation to hyper focus and tendril theory, other than I think it's somebody who had autism or ADHD was explaining her special interests and switching gears,
Hmm.
which is kind of a hyper focus.
Yeah, transitions is what, when I think of tendril theory, I think of like rough transitions, is because if you do an abrupt transition, that's kind of the imagery of kind of ripping you away from whatever you were doing. That may or may not be hyper focus, it's just switching tasks. Um,
Yeah,
but I think transitions and task switching is, from anecdotal experience, transitions and task switching is more difficult when you're in a hyper focused or hyper fixated state. Um,
definitely.
and the
And
fixated piece would be like feeling stuck. Feel like hyper fixated is like the negative of the same thing as hyper focused. I don't know.
yeah, no, that's an interesting distinction, and it sounds good because again, one of the speakers was like, because of the way a lot of ADHD brains work, you even if you're not, you will find something to hyper focus or fixate on, even if it's not something good or positive. And I can identify a couple of those negative focuses that because my brain needed something to focus on.
Hmm.
Um, that's another story for another time. But
Yeah, the word focus just evokes kind of like a productive use of your time, and the word
yeah, but
fixated reminds me of feeling stuck.
yeah, well, and interesting that there was Penn Holderness was one of the speakers, one of the
Mm.
keynotes, and he did an interesting piece on explaining awful as both, this great and amazing thing, but also terrifying and overwhelming and out of control.
Mm.
And sometimes, the focus and the consistently inconsistent show up because when we're in hyperfocus, we can do amazing things. But
Hmm.
if you can't find that engagement or your brain isn't interested in the thing you need to produce, sometimes other than urgency, you just can't get that focus and get that output.
Mm.
And if you don't know what's going on, it's kind of awful because it's like hope hyper focus is not always at will.
No.
Fixation is not always at will. The odds are higher if we have something interesting or engaging about it, even if it's negative, um, thinking about a terrible outcome of something is a hyper fixation or hyper focus that some people really get into.
Hmm. How does, I know you've worked with creatives before. How does hyper focus relate or not relate to being in a state of flow?
Um, Another one of those where they're often used interchangeably. I've heard them that they're both really high experiencing states. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi is the guy who first wrote about flow theory. And it's kind of an optimal experience of skill and personal skill and difficulty of the task being all engaging. I don't know if it's as hard to pull out of as it can be the hyper focus.
I just wonder from a neurodivergent perspective if there's any significant overlap, especially when it's
I
like
think there
something to
is.
do with a special interest or because yeah, like you said, it
I
gets
think
used
it
interchangeably. It
absolutely can
feels,
be.
yeah, like some of the work that I've been doing. Um,
You have probably been in a very deep flow state. You lose track of time in a
mhm,
flow state. It's engaging, it's kind of at the top of your skill set. So it's pushing just a little bit, but
mhm.
not so much that it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it's
Whereas hyperfocus can flip into like you said, we ignore ourselves and our needs to the point of our detriment.
yes. I feel like I do those things all at the same time sometimes. But
Well,
but
and the flow, I think for in normal flow stuff, I think people can come out of it and don't totally lose. I think perhaps the distinction is neurotypical people come out of those states a bit more easily.
I could see that. And the reason I had asked about flow is for the parent brain fog and what I'm rebranding as parent brain reboot versus mom brain. Um, that's one of my fun projects. Um, but thinking about my experience with the whole changes of my brain in parenthood, one of the things that I just really struggled doing during certain parts of pregnancy and postpartum with each of my kids has been getting into that flow state and being able to think like clearly enough and be able to just really let my brain go into something. And so now it's interesting looking back and kind of now the more things I know about the neuroscience and the psychology and the coaching psychology that goes with it in the brain, it's just interesting talking about neurodivergent brains and then also the parent brain and those moments when you just cannot get your brain to stick on any one thing. And it's just like,
And I mean, my personal hunch is that a lot of that parent brain unable to get into flow would be fatigue because your brain just doesn't have the resources to function.
and
It
it's
probably much
also,
less optimal.
I'm also suspecting that it's um, your executive function restructures itself during the like third trimester and then early postpartum and then it starts to get a little better, but when people are reporting in the studies when they're struggling the most with executive function skills, it's in that period that I also wonder if it's like your brain is physically remodeling itself and so therefore it just can't, it's a lot more difficult to get to that point. Whereas now
And
that
that
I'm
would
like at
make a
the
lot
other
of
end of the
sense.
timeline, I'm not fighting my brain to get there.
Right. And you've got a much deeper hit on the neuroscience and the current bits in that piece. But again, I also know that fatigue has such a massive impact and that, parents, and again, I don't know how much rest people
Yeah,
typically get or the quality of it during the third trimester, and I'm sure it varies dramatically,
very
but
dramatically, but not the wives' tale is that the third trimester is just training you for the sleeplessness of parenthood. Because it's like super uncomfortable and
well,
you have
yeah,
to
I mean,
wake
I
up to
can't
pee every
imagine
five
that it
seconds.
feels good. I mean, and again, being I haven't been through it, I hate to make those
Yeah, I'm just
unfounded
starting to try to think of like
assumptions.
the topics that we talk about. I'm starting to try to think, okay, how beyond the neurodivergence, how does it also tie into my work with parent brain science and parent focus coaching? So kind of looking at the
Yeah, no,
not
it
just the neurodivergence piece, but the other things I've learned.
it does make sense. And again, that's just my baseline based on my own fatigue and lived experiences that when I'm tired, my executive function is just 100 times worse and I can't sustain the focus on anything. And then, yeah, you add a whole bunch of neural remodeling and hormonal shifts and lack of sleep together. And I can imagine that it only amplifies the the cognitive challenges.
Yes, the whole
So
it's like
not just flow, but even
parenthood
just
definition is
basic
lack of sleep.
functioning. Yeah.
So we are at I started our timer late because I totally spaced out. So I know we're past our like 15 minutes ish. We're closer to 20 minutes.
Well, that's
So
all
what
right.
else?
Around 15 to 25. We're all
Yeah.
good.
So I was just wondering I just wanted to put that out there. Told you my brain was going to go all over the place today. So
Yep. But, again, that's brains and fatigue, and we operate in different spaces at different points in time. And yeah, that hyperfocus is great. It's usually interspace, something catching our attention, positive or negative. It can be hard to pull in and out of. And yeah, I think really just that it can be positive or negative. We don't always just hyperfocus on things that are useful or beneficial.
Mm-hmm. This is very true. True crime comes to mind, that it's like, oh, this is so fascinating. It's like, no, no, I don't need to fall down. I call them rabbit holes. I don't need to fall down that
Most of
rabbit
us
hole.
do. But yeah, it's, and so hyper focus and hyperfixation, like a lot of this, is a tool in understanding it. And we do have some influence, I think, on kind of sometimes where we can have it kick in, but it's not foolproof, either for starting or stopping or choosing the
Yes.
focus sometimes.
Well, with that, I think that was a good summary. Do we have anything else on our hyper-focus, hyper-fixation topic for today?
Um, we both run practices. If you want to work with either one of us, find us on our websites. I think we've got them on the cover. We may eventually even record something formal so we don't have to remember to say this every time, just because we've too have our own varying levels of working memory function and or deficit depending on the day. And we'd love to talk with people who are fascinated with the same stuff or just want to see some shift in their life.
Yep. And Amy, I'll add to that. Amy's expertise, and correct me if I'm wrong, is ADHD and neurodivergence. And she is do you call yourself a productivity coach? Productivity
I
coach?
I've always run under the tagline, helping neurodivergent thinkers shine. So somewhere
Like it.
between productivity and just understanding yourself and showing up in the world.
And my space is executive coaching on the business side, and parent focus coaching and productivity expert. And my tagline is redefine mom brain. So with that, I am Megan with Focus Like a Mother and Change HP.
And I'm Amy with Creative Catapult Coaching, and this is the Control Alt Think podcast.
See you next time. Bye.